Case 1. Charles Mackley. Inside the Ohio Penitentiary in the fall of 1934, two men on death row spent weeks carving the shape of a revolver into bars of soap and rubbing them black with shoe polish. On a Saturday morning in September, they pulled those soap guns on the corridor guards and started moving toward the door of the death house. They got as far as the riot squad before one of them was killed in the cell block. The other was paralyzed, and 3 weeks later was wheeled into the electric chair. Charles Omer Mackley was 44 years old. He had been born in November of 1889 in the small town of St. Mary's, Ohio, the eldest of 5 children of a working-class couple named Edward and Martha Mackley. He dropped out of school in the 8th grade and drifted into petty theft and then bootlegging, and from there into bank robbery across at least 3 Midwestern states. By 1924, going by an alias he liked to use, Charles McGray, he was arrested for a bank robbery in Wichita, Kansas. 4 years after that, in 1928, he was caught again, this time in Hammond, Indiana, and at the age of 39, he pleaded guilty before a circuit court judge to robbery and was sent to the Indiana State Prison at Michigan City to serve 10 to 21 years. Michigan City is where Charles Mackley met the men who would make him a name in American crime. He fell in with John Dillinger, Harry Pierpont, Russell Clark, and a handful of others. When Dillinger was paroled in the spring of 1933, Dillinger arranged for guns to be smuggled into the prison. On the 26th of September, 1933, Mackley and 9 other inmates broke out using those smuggled weapons. He moved up the most wanted lists almost overnight. The state of Illinois eventually ranked him as public enemy number 4. Federal investigators identified him as one of the core members of what the press had started calling the Dillinger Gang. The newspapers loved the gang. Their faces were on the front pages every week through that autumn, in mugshots and in artists' sketches, and what they did between bank jobs was tracked in the same column inches as the weather and the baseball scores. The country, in the depths of the Depression, had been spending most of 2 years reading newspaper accounts of men who were robbing the banks the country itself had been losing money to. The Dillinger Gang occupied that particular cultural moment. They were not folk heroes exactly, but they were the closest thing the era had to a serial story. Contemporaries treated him as a planner, the strategist of the group rather than a follower, the man who tended to map out the bank jobs in advance. The crime that put him on death row happened 12 days after the breakout. On the night of the 12th of October 1933, Pierpont, Mackley and Russell Clark drove into Lima, Ohio, where John Dillinger was being held in the county jail pending transfer. Sheriff Jess Saber, an Allen County lawman with a wife and a family, lived in a residence attached to the jail. When the 3 men forced their way inside and demanded the keys to Dillinger's cell, Saber refused. He was shot once. He was then pistol whipped. He died inside his own home in front of his wife Lucy Saber, while Dillinger was being walked out the front door. The killing took minutes. The men did not run, they walked. They took the keys, they unlocked the cell, and they left a small-town Ohio sheriff dying on the floor of his living quarters. The gang scattered. Through October, November, and December, they robbed banks across the Midwest, including a Greencastle, Indiana holdup that gave them roughly $74,728 in a single afternoon. Then, on the 25th of January 1934, a hotel fire in Tucson, Arizona, forced the gang into the open at the wrong moment. A handful of locals recognized them from newspaper photographs. Police arrested Mackley, Pierpont, Clark, and Dillinger without a shot fired. They were extradited east. The Ohio trial opened in Lima in early March. Lucy Saber took the stand on the 8th of March 1934 and described what she had watched happen to her husband inside her own home. Deputy Wilbur Sharp testified beside her. Pierpont was tried first and convicted on the 11th of March. Mackley's separate trial finished 6 days later with a first-degree murder conviction. On the 24th of March, both men received death sentences. Russell Clark, tried for the same killing but convicted of second-degree murder, drew a life sentence instead. The distinction between the 3 of them would matter on the morning of the breakout, because Clark, knowing he had a life term to serve rather than a chair to face, had less reason to run than Mackley or Pierpont did. Mackley and Pierpont were transferred to the Ohio Penitentiary in Columbus, into the cell block that held condemned men awaiting the chair. The same building had executed Ohio prisoners for more than half a century by then. The death house and the death row sat at the back of the main complex, behind a series of locked corridors and steel screens, in a layout that was supposed to make exactly the kind of attempt Makeley was about to try impossible. They began carving the soap. They had time. They had bars of plain prison-issue soap in their cells, more than they needed for any actual washing. They had shoe polish. They had patience, because the only other thing on their schedule was the chair. The guns the two men made were almost convincing. They sized them roughly to a real revolver, they painted them with shoe polish from the prison commissary, and they kept them hidden in their cells through the spring and summer of 1934. By September, they were ready. On the morning of the 22nd of September, a guard the contemporaneous press identified only as Slagel brought Pierpont his breakfast on a tray. Pierpont said he was feeling sick. As Slagel leaned in, Pierpont sprang up, slugged him in the head, pulled out his soap pistol and held it on him. Across the corridor, Makeley and Russell Clark drew their own soap guns on a second guard, a man named J.T. Jones, who was seated behind a screen overseeing the death row block. Jones did most of what he was told. The one thing he managed to do, before fully complying, was hit a buzzer that summoned the prison riot squad. That single second of nerve was what decided everything. Pierpont and Makeley unlocked Russell Clark's cell. Clark, the one of the three who was not under a death sentence, looked at what was happening and lost his nerve. He went back inside his cell. Makeley and Pierpont kept moving, pushing toward the door of the death house at the end of the corridor. They were close. And then the riot squad came in. The first guards through the gate were carrying live weapons. They opened fire down the length of the cell block. The acoustics of an enclosed corridor will tell you the entire shape of what happened next without anyone having to describe it. The shots were close. The shots were many. The men with the live rounds were not, that morning, in any mood to negotiate with two condemned men holding pieces of soap. Makeley was struck multiple times by the volley of return fire. He fell in the corridor and died at the scene. He was 44 years old. Pierpont was also hit, severely, and survived the shots only to be left paralysed from the waist down. 3.5 weeks later, on the 17th of October 1934, Ohio prison staff lifted Harry Pierpont out of his hospital bed, carried him to the electric chair, and executed him. He could not walk to his own death. He had to be carried to it. It was an unusual scene for an Ohio execution at the time. Most condemned men walked. The wheels of an early electric chair were built around the assumption that the prisoner could stand and turn and sit. Pierpont could do none of those things. The state did it for him. The newspapers ran the breakout on their front pages. The New York Sunday News, on the morning of the 23rd of September, led with a banner about a Dillinger aide killed and another shot during a soap pistol prison break. The Detroit Free Press topped its front page with the line about Dillinger's pal slain in a dash and a second man shot. Across the country, readers learned for the first time that two men had spent weeks carving fake guns out of soap inside an American death house, and had almost made it out. The Ohio Penitentiary changed its procedures within weeks. The amount of soap a death row inmate could be issued at one time was capped. Hygiene supplies were checked more carefully. The case became a teaching example in the early professional literature of correctional security, and 100 years on, it is still cited in standards manuals as one of the founding case studies in why prisons inventory ordinary household items. The bigger picture is what made the September breakout feel, in hindsight, like a closing chapter rather than a beginning. By the time Makeley and Pierpont were carving soap, the public enemy era of the early 30s was already ending. John Dillinger had been killed on a Chicago sidewalk on the 22nd of July, 1934, 2 months before Makeley's last morning. By October, Pierpont was in the chair. By the following year, most of the original Dillinger gang was either dead or back in custody for the rest of their lives. Makeley's body was sent home to Leipzig, Ohio, for a small private burial. For decades, the grave was unmarked. In the 2010s, an amateur historian named Laurie Hyde led an effort to put a headstone on it, an act of straightforward record-keeping rather than commemoration. Jess Saber, the Sheriff Makeley and Pierpont and Clark had killed in his own home in front of his wife, is remembered differently. His name is on the Allen County Sheriff's Office Honor Roll and on the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial in Washington, where his death is one of dozens of small inscriptions that tell, in 2 or 3 words each, the story of a working lawman shot in the line of duty in 1933 by men who were trying to get a friend out of a cell. The friend they got out, John Dillinger, would outlive Saba by exactly 9 months and 1 week. Charles Mackley died in a corridor on the wrong side of a buzzer because he and his cellmate believed they could bluff the men with the keys using soap guns. The story to come moved 40 years forward into the 1970s and into a Texas prison library, where a narcotics trafficker with a life sentence rolled an entire law school worth of books out of the building toward an armoured car waiting in the courtyard. He almost made it. And when the plan came apart, he chose not to be captured. Case 2. Fred Carrasco. A drug trafficking kingpin with a life sentence spent 11 days holding hostages inside the 3rd floor library of the oldest prison in Texas. On the final night, he wrapped himself and 3 accomplices and 4 hostages inside a rolling shield made of 2 chalkboards and 700 pounds of law books, and he tried to walk it out the door to an armoured car the governor of Texas had personally authorised. The shield got as far as the last turn in the corridor. The fire hoses opened up. The books got wet. And when the shooting stopped 22 minutes later, the kingpin was found inside the wreckage, having taken his own life. Federico Gomez Carrasco was 34 years old. He had been born in February of 1940 in San Antonio, Texas. By the early 1970s, the Drug Enforcement Administration had identified him as the operator of one of the most significant narcotics distribution networks moving product up out of Mexico, with reported corridors running from San Diego across to Chicago. They gave him the nickname, the Mexican Connection. Law enforcement in 2 countries suspected him personally of dozens of killings, most of them rival traffickers and informants in Mexico and South Texas. He was captured in July of 1973 after a shootout with San Antonio police, in which he was shot 4 times in the leg. He was convicted of attempted murder of a peace officer and sentenced to life in the Texas Department of Corrections, and sent to serve it at the Huntsville Walls Unit, the oldest prison in the state, an old brick fortress at the corner of 12th Street in the city of Huntsville. The men who arrested him in San Antonio told reporters later, in a line that has been preserved in Texas Prison Museum oral history, that they wished they had killed him when they had the chance. What he did inside the Walls Unit was the kind of thing that only works if you can corrupt the supply chain. Through a bribed prison worker, Carrasco had 3 .38 caliber Magnum pistols smuggled into the prison, hidden inside a canned ham, and more than 300 rounds of ammunition hidden inside peach cans. That kind of supply chain only works because someone inside is willing to look the other way at the right moment. The exact identity of the worker who let the canned ham and the peach cans through was never fully resolved in court, but the route the weapons took into the Walls Unit was reconstructed afterward almost in detail. Carrasco had been planning the siege for months before he started it. He had 2 other inmates ready to move with him, Rudy Dominguez and Ignacio Cuevas, both serving long terms. At 1 o'clock on the afternoon of the 24th of July 1974, Carrasco walked into the 3rd floor library of the prison's education building. He was walking with a limp, possibly faked, possibly real. He had the .38 on him. Inside that library, on a normal Wednesday afternoon, were prison employees, a Catholic chaplain named Joseph O'Brien, the school principal Novella Pollard, 4 inmates working as library helpers, and 2 civilian instructors, a teacher named Yvonne Besida, who ran GED classes for inmates, and a librarian named Judy Standley. Dominguez and Cuevas joined Carrasco in the room. They drew their weapons. The library locked down. The siege ran 11 days. It is one of the longest prison hostage events in American history. For 11 days in the middle of a Texas summer, a 3rd floor library on the campus of an old brick prison in Huntsville became the front page of every newspaper in the country. The director of the Texas Department of Corrections, James Estelle Jr., ran negotiations from a temporary command post in the warden's office, the room everyone took to calling the think tank. Carrasco's own attorney, Ruben Montemayor, helped at points. An FBI agent named Bob Wyatt sat in on the other side of the door for almost the entire 11 days. Carrasco made his demands: bulletproof helmets, tailored men's suits, dress shoes, cologne, walkie-talkies, an armoured truck large enough to take him and his accomplices and a handful of hostages to Cuba, where he said he would personally appeal to Fidel Castro for asylum. The truck part of the request, improbably, was authorised. Texas Governor Dolph Briscoe signed off on an armoured vehicle being moved into the prison courtyard. The understanding inside the think tank was that the vehicle would never actually be allowed to leave the gates, that any ambush would happen before that point, but the truck itself was real and it was waiting. Whether Carrasco believed he was actually going to drive out of the front gate of the Walls unit and onto a back road to a Mexican airfield, or whether he was simply running out his last hand, has been argued by everyone who has ever told this story since. What he built to make the trip was something the press would later call the Trojan horse, and the men who took it apart would also call the Trojan taco. It was a rolling shield made out of 2 of the library's 6x6 foot chalkboards, taped together with about 700 pounds of law school casebooks packed between them. The casebooks were chosen because they were the heaviest, densest items in the library, and bound law books had been known to stop a small caliber round. Carrasco and his 2 accomplices were going to handcuff themselves inside the 3-foot space between the chalkboards, along with 4 hostages, and a second group of 8 hostages would be handcuffed to a rope and herded around the outside of the shield, walking it down the ramp from the 3rd floor to the courtyard where the truck was waiting. At 27 minutes past 9 in the evening on the 3rd of August 1974, the shield started moving. Inside it, with Carrasco, Dominguez and Cuevas, were Yvonne Beseda, Judy Standley, the principal, Novella Pollard, and the priest, Joseph O'Brien. Outside, 8 more hostages were chained to the rope. The Trojan horse rolled forward. It made the first 3 turns of the ramp. At the 4th, the last right-angle turn before the courtyard, the men with the guns were waiting. Bob Wyatt and Texas Ranger captains Pete Rogers and G.W. Burks had organised an ambush built around water. 3 high-pressure fire hoses from the Huntsville Fire Department opened up on the shield from 3 angles at once. The shield began to tip. The 700 pounds of law books inside it began to slide. For a moment it looked like Wyatt's plan was about to work, and the entire structure was about to come down on its side. Then one of the 3 hoses ruptured. The shield righted itself, and Carrasco, looking through the small ports he and his accomplices had cut in the chalkboards for shooting through, opened fire. The hollow point round from Carrasco's pistol struck Yvonne Beseda. She died inside the shield. Rudy Dominguez fired 3 rounds at Judy Standley. She died inside the shield. Joseph O'Brien took a round in the left arm that splintered the bone and drove a small piece of metal into his chest. Novella Pollard survived. So did Cuevas. The gun battle that followed lasted 22 minutes. Bob Wyatt and the 2 Ranger captains each took rounds in their ballistic vests and stayed on their feet and kept shooting. Officers used a ladder as a battering ram against the shield. TDC Lieutenant Willard Stewart, working under fire, cut the 8 outside hostages free of the rope and pulled them clear. By the time the shield finally came apart, 3 of the 4 people inside it who had not been hostages were down. A Texas Department of Public Safety intelligence officer fired 3 rounds into Rudy Dominguez and killed him. Ignacio Cuevas, who had taken an indirect hit and was lying still, slid out in the water and torn law book pages and was taken into custody alive. The last shots were fired at 10 minutes to 10. Fred Carrasco was found inside the wreckage of the shield. He had taken his own life rather than be captured by the officers closing in on the cell block. The siege was over. The last shots had been fired at 10 minutes to 10. From the moment the chalkboard contraption rolled out of the library to the moment the final shot was fired, the entire decisive engagement had lasted just under 22 minutes. The 11 days were finished. The body was 34 years old. The kingpin who had run narcotics from San Diego to Chicago, who had made the DEA nervous for half a decade, who had been suspected of dozens of killings, ended his life inside 700 pounds of soaked law books on the 3rd floor of a Texas prison. Ignacio Cuevas was charged with the capital murders of Yvonne Beseda and Judy Standley. He was convicted in Texas state court. he was sentenced to death. And on the 23rd of May 1991, almost 17 years to the day after the siege had ended, the state of Texas executed him by lethal injection inside the Walls unit. He died inside the same prison where he had killed. Cuevas was the only one of the 3 men who had walked into the library that July afternoon to live long enough to face a Texas jury. He had been, by the description of Father O'Brien and other survivors, the most reluctant of the 3. He went to the chamber anyway. The state did not draw distinctions between roles in a capital murder where the bodies in the room had been hostages. The Walls Unit Education Building, the one with the 3rd floor library, was renamed the Stanley Beseda Education Building in a ceremony in 1999 attended by survivors and family members. The Texas Prison Museum in Huntsville still keeps the welder's mask helmets the 3 inmates had rigged for the breakout, and the chalkboards, and a section of the rope, and the case is one of the centerpieces of the permanent exhibit. A 50th anniversary panel was held there in 2024, and several of the surviving hostages sat on it, and so did some of the officers who had been outside the library door for 11 days in the summer of 1974. The protocols the Texas prison system put in place after the siege are still in force. No armoured vehicle is authorised to enter a Texas prison yard during a hostage event under any circumstances. Tactical assault, rather than negotiated movement, is the standing response. Food packages and mail are screened in a way they were not screened in the summer of 1974. A man cannot, today, walk 3 Magnum pistols into a Texas Department of Criminal Justice library inside a canned ham. Fred Carrasco died inside a shield made of books because he could not accept the only other thing waiting for him, which was a Texas prison cell for the rest of his life. The story to come moved 23 years on into the desert outside Florence, Arizona, where another death row inmate decided that the only person who could get him out of his sentence was his own brand new wife, who would drive to the perimeter of the prison in the early morning with a rifle. Quick note before the next one: subscribing is free, and it is the simplest way to make sure the next breakdown like this one lands in your feed. Case 3. Floyd Bennett Thornton Jr. A condemned man in the Arizona desert married a woman by mail from his cell on death row. 6 months after the wedding, she drove out to the perimeter fence of the prison with a rifle in the back of her car. He shed his shackles in a vegetable garden, ran toward her, and shouted at the guards in the towers to shoot him. He was sorry, he yelled, that things had gone wrong. The guards in the towers did what he asked. By the time the gunfire stopped, both halves of the marriage were dead on opposite sides of the fence. Floyd Bennett Thornton Jr. was 36 years old. He had grown up in the American Southwest with a long criminal record by the time he was an adult, and by the early 1990s he was a felon already prohibited from possessing a firearm. He was charged at trial with 2 killings, both in Cochise County, Arizona, both at the homes of his own victims. Both victims were older. Both were inside their own homes when he arrived. Both were shot at close range in front of someone who loved them. In the summer of 1991, a man named William Prince came home to his home in Cochise County, Arizona, and found Thornton inside, burglarizing it. Thornton shot him at close range. A witness outside the property saw Thornton flee. William Prince died that day. 13 days later, Thornton crashed William Prince's car in Oregon, and a neighbor's call to the local sheriff led to his arrest. The federal system, working on the felon in possession charge alone, gave him a life sentence in Oregon. The state of Arizona then extradited him back to Cochise County to face the Prince murder. In 1993, while he was being held in the Cochise County jail awaiting trial for the Prince killing, Thornton escaped. 2 days after the escape, in the town of Bisbee, he broke into the home of a married couple named Dale and Mary Duke. Dale Duke was 74 years old. The Dukes came home, and Thornton, who was already inside, took a shotgun out of the house and turned it on Dale. He shot him at close range in front of his wife. Then he asked Mary, calmly, for directions to the Mexican border. She gave him what he wanted. He was arrested later that day on the road between Bisbee and Douglas, driving Dale Duke's truck. The trial was consolidated. A Cochise County jury in 1994 convicted him of first-degree murder, burglary, kidnapping, and escape on both killings. He was sentenced to death for the murder of Dale Duke and to life for the murder of William Prince. He raised an insanity defense. The Arizona Supreme Court, on the 12th of December 1996, affirmed his convictions and his sentences in an opinion written by Justice Frederick J. Martone. The opinion is the formal record of the case. It is the document that establishes what was on the books on the morning of the perimeter shooting: 2 killings, a kidnapping, an escape, and a death sentence for the older of the 2 victims. The Arizona court, in handling the insanity defense, ruled that by raising it, Thornton had waived his physician-patient privilege. His prior mental health records were compelled into evidence. The court did not publish a specific diagnosis, but the documentation laid out a long history that the state argued spoke more to a man making decisions he understood the consequences of than to a man who did not know what he was doing. By that month, he had been on Arizona's death row at the state prison complex in Florence for 2 years. The marriage came together by mail. Sometime in 1996, while he was still in custody, Thornton struck up a correspondence with a woman named Rebecca Lynn Thornton, who was at the time living in Tacoma, Washington. Rebecca had divorced her previous husband in the summer of 1995. By the late autumn of 1996, she was writing letters to a condemned man in Arizona. In January of 1997, the 2 of them held a prison ceremony at the Florence complex and were legally married. She moved to Arizona within weeks. The decision Rebecca Thornton made to leave Tacoma and to relocate her life to a small town in the Arizona desert for the sake of being closer to a husband she had married inside a death row visiting room was a decision the families of the men he had killed found impossible to understand at the time. They had to read about it in the newspapers. The companion of William Prince had watched him die in his own home in 1991. Mary Duke had watched her husband die in 1993, and in 1997, the man responsible was newly married. What happened on the 9th of July 1997 was the product of a controversial Arizona corrections program. The state had, at the time, a death row chain gang. The program put condemned inmates in shackles outside the perimeter fence doing supervised labor. It was a political message rather than an operational necessity, and one of the things it did, for a man who was thinking about getting out, was put him within 100 feet of a public road and a willing accomplice with a car. Thornton was assigned that morning to a vegetable garden alongside a chain-link perimeter fence at the Arizona State Prison Complex in Florence. He was in leg irons. He was working with 2 other death row inmates. All 3 of them had, it turned out, been slowly cutting at the leather of their shackles for some time. Just before 8 in the morning, Rebecca Thornton pulled her car up to the side of the road that ran along the perimeter fence. She had with her a rifle. Public reporting at the time described it variously as an AK-style rifle and as an AK-47. The make and model were never definitively confirmed in court records. She had a handgun as well. She opened fire through the car window. The shots were directed across the fence at the watchtowers and at the guards along the perimeter. Then she stepped out of the car, switched to the handgun, and walked closer to the fence on foot. Floyd Thornton shed what was left of his shackles and ran. The guards in the watchtowers fired first with non-lethal rounds, beanbags, and rubber pellets from 12-gauge shotguns. Those rounds knocked Thornton down. He got back up. He kept running toward his wife on the other side of the fence. He was shouting. The Arizona Department of Corrections spokeswoman, Camilla Strongin, would describe the words to reporters within hours. He was telling the guards in the towers to shoot him. He was telling them he was sorry. He was telling them that things had gone wrong and to shoot him. They did. The guards switched to live rounds. The first volley caught him before he reached the fence. The second volley caught Rebecca Thornton on her side of it. Both halves of the marriage went down inside 10 seconds of each other. Officials inside the Arizona Department of Corrections, in the first hours after the shooting, said openly that they could not initially determine whether Floyd Thornton had been killed by his wife's stray rounds fired across the fence at the guards, or by the guards' live fire. Eyewitnesses reported that Rebecca had fired in his direction during the moments before she turned the handgun outward. The autopsy-level attribution of which bullet finished him was never publicly resolved. The Arizona Department of Corrections, in the days that followed, said only that he had died from gunfire at the perimeter. Rebecca Thornton, 38 years old, was a free citizen with no criminal record of her own. She had been killed by guards while standing outside a state prison, shooting through its fence at the men inside it. No staff or other inmates were seriously hurt. The 2 other death row inmates, whose shackles had also been partially cut, were taken into segregation. They had not run. That distinction mattered. The 2 other inmates had, like Thornton, been quietly working at the leather of their shackles. They had not, in the moment, made the same choice. They watched Rebecca Thornton pull up to the fence line. They watched the gunfire start. They stayed where they were. The civil and political consequences came in stages. The Duke family had already, in the years after Dale's death, won a separate $2.1 million civil judgment against Cochise County for negligence in allowing Thornton's pre-trial jail escape in 1993. That judgment was old news by the morning of the perimeter shooting. The new political consequence was the killing of Rebecca, a free citizen on a public road outside a state prison. Civil liberties groups across Arizona pointed at the death row chain gang as the program that had let a condemned man come within 10 feet of his accomplice in broad daylight. The state quietly scaled the program back. Within a few years, it had been ended. The state's death row outside work program, in the form Floyd Thornton had been part of, did not survive the political fallout of a free woman killed on a state highway by state guards. The program had been billed as cost-effective and as visibly punitive. It had also, in this single morning, given a condemned man and his accomplice a moment to almost pull off a movie scene. Arizona, after that, kept its death row inside the walls. The shooting at the perimeter fence has been studied since by correctional academies as a textbook example of how an externally orchestrated breakout can fail before it ever fully begins. The accomplice on the outside, in cases like this one, almost always becomes the casualty alongside the inmate. The model itself is unstable. There are very few examples in modern American corrections of a death row inmate getting through a perimeter fence with the help of someone waiting on the other side of it and living long enough to make use of the assistance. Camilla Strongin, the corrections spokeswoman, became the public face of the agency's response in the long week after the killings. The story landed in newspapers in Spokane and Tampa and Salt Lake City, in part because Rebecca Thornton had been a Washington state resident, in part because the image of a husband on death row shouting at a tower guard to "please shoot him" was the kind of image that did not let a newsroom go. Floyd Bennett Thornton Jr. died at the fence line of an Arizona prison in 1997 because the state had, against the better judgment of many of its own officers, put him on the wrong side of the wire with a wife waiting in a car. The next story takes the location of an attempted death row escape and turns up the difficulty. Texas in 1998 had not lost a man off death row in 64 years. On the night of a Thanksgiving dinner, 7 men jumped off a roof at the Ellis unit and ran for the perimeter, and one of them made it over the second fence. Where he went after that is the part of the story Texas still teaches. Case 4. Martin Garule. A Texas death row inmate stuffed his bunk with pillows and sheets to make it look like he was asleep on Thanksgiving night of 1998. He had spent weeks taping rolled-up newspapers and pieces of cardboard under his clothing to use as armour against razor wire. He and 6 other condemned men jumped off a recreation building roof in the dark and ran for the perimeter fences. 6 of them were stopped by gunfire before they reached the wire. He cleared both fences. He vanished into a wooded creek bottom in East Texas. He was the first inmate in 64 years to escape Texas death row, and he was already dead by the time the search dogs were unloaded. Martin Edward Garule was 29 years old. He had been born in November of 1969 in Corpus Christi, Texas, the son of a United States Army serviceman named Eugene Garule and a young mother named Mary Lillian Mares Garule. His mother died shortly before his first birthday. He was raised mostly by his paternal grandmother in a small frame house on the predominantly Hispanic west side of Corpus Christi, with his father away on military postings for long stretches. He attended W.B. Ray High School, took several honours classes, and worked at the Corpus Christi State School, an institution that cared for intellectually disabled patients. The teachers and the co-workers who knew him at that age described him as polite and even-tempered. He committed his first bank robbery at 16. By the time he was 22, he had convictions dating back 5 years for credit card fraud, theft, and 2 bank robberies, plus a pending assault charge. He had, according to a Texas Monthly feature on the case, one specific personal phobia. He hated needles. That phobia would take on a dark resonance when, years later, he was sent to a death row whose method of execution was lethal injection. The killings that put him there happened just after midnight on the 12th of October, 1992. Earlier that month, Gurilay's 23-year-old girlfriend, Melissa Smith, had been fired from her cashier's job at a small Greek diner in Corpus Christi called the U&I restaurant after roughly $350 went missing from her till. The U&I was a family-run place. It was owned by 2 brothers, Mike and George Piperis. The night Gurulay walked in, the diner had closed for the night. Mike Piperis was on shift, so was a cook named Tony Staten. Mike Piperis was 46 years old, Tony Staten was 31. Gurulay had a 10mm Colt Delta Elite. He had cut the external phone lines before walking in. He forced Mike Piperis to open the restaurant's safe. He took roughly $9,000 in cash. Then, with no provocation and no struggle, he shot Tony Staten at close range while Staten was seated. He shot Mike Piperis from behind while Piperis was kneeling in front of the open safe. Both men died instantly. The prosecutor on the case, Mark Skirka, who would later become the elected district attorney of Nueces County, said years afterward that Gurulay had always been able to talk his way out of anything, and that at trial, Gurulay tried one more time. He took the stand and claimed Mike Piperis had asked him to come into the diner that night to discuss tax fraud with the IRS, and that the gun had gone off during a struggle. The story did not survive the autopsy reports. Both men had been killed at close range from behind. There was no struggle. He and Melissa Smith were arrested the following year. Gurulay attempted to flee the Corpus Christi courthouse during a lunch break in his trial. He did not get far. In July of 1993, a Nueces County jury convicted him of capital murder and sentenced him to death. Melissa Smith was convicted of 2 counts of non-capital murder and sentenced to 25 years. She was paroled in 2005. Skirka, the Nueces County prosecutor, said at the sentencing that the case had been a crime that had been building up over years. By 1998, Gurulay had been on death row at the Ellis Unit in Walker County for 5 years. The Ellis Unit at that time ran something called the Work Capable Program. It was a discretionary initiative that let about 150 condemned inmates leave their cells, mingle with general population prisoners, and perform supervised work. The program existed because some prison administrators believed that work was therapeutic, and because the program saved on labour costs. It had been operating in some form for years before Gurulay arrived. It also gave the men in it access to industrial tools, to fences, to materials, and to one another in ways that the standard locked-down design of an American death row was specifically intended to prevent. The program was also exactly the kind of arrangement that gave a determined man like Martin Gurulay access to materials and access to one another. 6 of his fellow condemned men joined him on the plan. They had been working it for weeks. They had been quietly cutting at one of the interior fences. They had been collecting newspapers and cardboard, sliding rolled bundles of paper under the layers of their clothing to act as armour against razor wire. They had figured out the roof lines on the recreation building. The Ellis Unit's interior, in the late 1990s, had not been designed around the assumption that condemned men would spend weeks studying the construction of buildings around them. The work-capable program had given them exactly the time and the freedom to do that. They had used both. On Thanksgiving Day, the 26th of November, 1998, before they were marched to Thanksgiving dinner, they arranged their pillows and their sheets in their bunks to look like sleeping bodies. They went to dinner. They came back. And then, in the hours after midnight, they hid themselves in a recreation room and climbed onto the roof of the recreation building. A guard spotted 7 figures jumping from the roof and hit the alarm. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice spokesman Larry Fitzgerald, said afterward that the guard fired between 18 and 20 rounds. 6 of the 7 men dropped to the ground and surrendered. The 7th man kept running. He sprinted about 100 feet across an open field. He scaled the first razor wire fence. He ran another 70 feet across the next clearing. He scaled the second razor wire fence. He disappeared into the trees. One of the guards reported seeing him fall briefly between the 2 fences. No blood was found on the ground at the time, but it would be the wound from that moment that a few hours later would be the reason he could not climb out of a flooded creek. For the first time in 64 years, a man had broken off Texas death row. The last person to do it had been one of the men Bonnie and Clyde had sprung from the Eastern Unit in January of 1934, an inmate named Raymond Hamilton. The Hamilton breakout had been front-page news in 1934. The Gurule breakout, 6.5 decades later, was front-page news of a different kind, because there was now television. More than 500 officers from surrounding towns and counties joined the manhunt. Sniffer dogs, mounted units, boats on the Trinity River, helicopters with infrared optics. The governor of Texas, George W. Bush, called in the Texas Rangers and announced a $5,000 reward. The search ran for a week. None of it found Martin Gurule alive. On the 3rd of December 1998, 2 off-duty prison workers were fishing on their day off at the mouth of a Trinity River tributary called Harmon Creek, about a mile from the Ellis unit. One of them snagged something heavy. They had found him. The body, after a week in the water, still wore the cardboard armour Gurule had taped under his clothes. The autopsy reconstructed what had happened. Gurule had been hit during the initial gunfire from the watchtower guard by a grazing round to the back. The wound was disabling rather than immediately fatal. He had made it across both fences and into the woods. He had likely hid under a bridge across Harmon Creek. As the dogs and the mounted units worked the area in the hours afterward, he had been forced into the moving water of the creek. The wound in his back made it impossible for him to climb out of it. The cause of death was drowning. For a man who had hated needles, who had hated the thought of a lethal injection chamber, drowning in a flooded East Texas creek with a fatal injury to the back was a death that had at least kept him out of the room he had spent 5 years dreading. The time of death was estimated to the night of the 27th of November. He had been dead for almost the entire week the state had been looking for him. The director of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, Gary Johnson, told reporters at the press conference announcing the recovery of the body that the public risk had now ended. He was speaking to the families of the staff and to the families of the surrounding counties. But he was also speaking, in a way, to the families of Mike Piperis and Tony Staten, who had spent a long week wondering whether the man who had killed their husband and their son had gotten away clean. Gurule had been the only one of the 7 men in the breakout who had made it past the second fence. He was also the only one who had not lived to see Thanksgiving morning. The aftermath rewrote Texas death row. The work-capable program was shut down. In March of 1999, the entire Texas male death row was relocated out of the Ellis unit and into the new Terrell unit, later renamed for the Texas prison official Alan B. Polunsky in West Livingston, Polk County. Under the new regime, condemned men were locked down for 22 to 23 hours per day. They did not mingle. They did not work outside their cells. The Polunsky unit's protocols remain in force, and Martin Gurule's escape remains the most recent successful breakout off any death row anywhere in the United States. That single fact, more than anything else about the case, is what it gets remembered for. A 2005 escape by a Texas inmate named Charles Victor Thompson is sometimes cited as a comparison, but Thompson was being held in a county jail for a resentencing hearing, not on death row proper. Gurule died in a flooded East Texas creek bottom because the gunshot he had taken on his way over the second fence was just enough to keep him from climbing out of the water. The story to come moved across the world, to South Africa, to a maximum security prison in Pretoria that the country's correctional minister had publicly promised would never again be breached. Inside it, 2 men were about to take 2 prison officials hostage in a hallway, only to discover that the gates between them and freedom would not open. If you are still here, that says something. Hitting subscribe is free, no sign up, and it is what keeps this kind of deep dive coming. Case 5. Ronnie Nenyatso, a South African correctional minister, had stood in front of cameras the previous summer and promised the public that the country's most secure prison, the CMAX wing of Pretoria Central, would never again be breached. 5 months later, 2 inmates with a pistol that had been smuggled in by a corrupt warder took 2 prison officials hostage in a corridor, marched them toward the gates, shot both of them dead, and then, when the automatic security gates would not open, turned the same weapon on themselves rather than face capture. The total dead inside the most secure prison in South Africa, by the end of the morning, was 4. CMAX was, in 2004, the place the South African Department of Correctional Services sent the men they did not trust to keep anywhere else. It was inside the larger Pretoria Central complex, the same complex later renamed Kagozi Mampuru II. CMAX held the country's apartheid-era killers, including the notorious Eugene de Kock, alongside serial murderers such as Moses Sithole. It was, by the description of South African correctional officials at the time, the prison that the country sent the men no other prison was willing to take. The unit had been built specifically to contain that population. It was a closed-circuit, single-corridor, lockdown by default facility, with automatic gates that were supposed to require multiple staff confirmations to open. The design was the answer to a long history of escapes from older South African prisons. The architects of CMAX had treated the question of getting out as the central problem, and had built everything else around it. The cells, the exercise yard, the visiting protocols, the food deliveries, all of it ran through a single hardened pipeline. Ronnie Nenyatso was housed inside it. Public reporting from the time spelled his first name multiple ways, sometimes Ronnie, sometimes Ronnie, and his surname 2 ways, sometimes Menyatso, sometimes Nenyatso. The trial record from the 2007 prosecution of the men who had helped him used Nenyatso. He had been convicted of murder. He was serving a long sentence at CMAX. His full record, as the South African press eventually reported it, included murder, theft, armed robbery, attempted murder, illegal possession of a firearm and ammunition, and a prior escape from custody. That last item, the prior escape, is the part of the record the South African correctional system had been told to take seriously. The file already classified him as a man who would try again. The transfer to Pretoria's CMAX wing had been built around exactly that classification. That last one is the relevant detail. The system had already classified him as a man who had tried to get out of a previous prison and would try again if given the opportunity. He had been transferred to Pretoria from Pollsmoor Prison in Cape Town not long before. Pollsmoor itself, in Cape Town, was one of the better-known maximum security prisons in South Africa, but CMAX was a separate animal. CMAX had been built specifically to hold the men whom even Pollsmoor was considered insufficient to contain. The transfer of Nenyatso to Pretoria, in the months before the killings, was the system telling itself that it had this man under the tightest controls available. His partner in what happened on the 7th of November, 2004, was a 30-year-old inmate named Gift Mpo Kanyago, also spelled in some accounts as Klangago. Kanyago was serving life for armed robbery with aggravating circumstances. His record was, like Nenyatso's, the kind that classified him into the highest custody tier. The 2 men had not, by all accounts, known each other before they ended up housed in the same secure block at Pretoria. The 2 victims who would die that morning were both correctional staff. Sam Gomba was the head of CMAX. He had held the post for 3 years. He had a wife, a nursing sister at a Pretoria hospital named Gertrude Gomba, and 2 children. The family had been in the middle of planning a wedding for one of his relatives at the time of his death. Press accounts gave his age as either 45 or 47. The second victim was a man named Ben Ndenisa, 41 years old, the acting area coordinator for the prison complex, with a widow named Grace Ndenisa. What happened on the 7th of November began as a routine Sunday cell inspection. Kanyago and Nenyatso had by that point a pistol. The investigation that followed in the years afterward charged a prison warder named Herman Makubela and a prisoner named Patrick Mabuza with smuggling the firearm into the facility. The trial would also feature testimony from a fellow inmate named King Winner Maluleka, who alleged that Makabela had agreed to supply the firearm in exchange for a promised minibus. A minibus, in the South African economy of the early 2000s, was a small business. Whoever owned one could run a route for paying passengers. The promise to a corrupt warder of a vehicle that could be used to start his own informal taxi enterprise was, by the standards of the underground market that the trial described, plausible compensation. Two other inmates, Thabo Perfidi and Freddie Teen, were ultimately sentenced for their roles in the plot. The specific terms varied between sources, with contemporaneous reporting citing different figures. The plot, in other words, had not been the work of two men acting alone. There had been a small network inside the prison, communicating across cells, communicating with at least one corrupt staff member, organising the smuggling of a firearm into a wing of the building whose entire design premise was that this was impossible. During the inspection, Kanyago and Nenyatso took Sam Gomba and Ben and Denisa hostage. The plan was simple. They would force Gomba, as the head of the prison, to walk them out of the secure block through the gates that he had the authority to command open. Kanyago demanded that Gomba do exactly that. Gomba refused. The Pretoria area commissioner, a man named Mkabela, would describe what happened next at the funeral service held the following Thursday on the rugby field at the Pretoria prison. He said that Sam Gomba had refused to surrender his authority to the men who had taken him hostage. He had been told to give the order. He had said no. That single decision, by a man with 3 years inside the wing as its commander, is what made Sam Gomba the figure his family and his colleagues kept describing afterward. He could have given the order. The gates would have opened. He might have walked out alive. He decided that his job was to refuse, and he refused. He died for it. Kanyago opened fire on Gomba, who was loaded into a vehicle and rushed toward a hospital. He died en route. Nenyatso, watching this happen, walked over to Kanyago and asked for the pistol. According to the court evidence reconstructed in the South African press from witnesses inside the corridor, Nenyatso asked to be the one to handle the second hostage. He took the pistol from Kanyago. He fired on Ben and Denisa twice, and Denisa died in the corridor. Inside CMAX, the layout meant nobody in the rest of the prison could see directly into the wing where this was happening. The killings unfolded in a kind of enclosed quiet, broken only by the gunshots themselves and by the radio traffic of staff trying to figure out what they were hearing. They moved toward the gates with the bodies behind them. The automatic security gates of CMAX, exactly as the system had been designed, would not open. Without Gomba's command authority and without the multi-staff confirmation the gates required, the locks held. The two men could not get past the next set of steel doors. The moment they understood that, the math of the situation changed. Both of them now had 2 homicides on top of their existing sentences. There was no way out. There was no negotiation that was going to follow this. The South African system would, at best, prosecute them and put them back into a more locked-down cell than the one they had walked out of. At worst, the responding tactical unit would deal with them on contact. What they chose, in those next minutes, was a final choice made together. The two of them took their own lives rather than face capture. By the time correctional staff and tactical officers reached the corridor, all 4 men in the corridor had stopped moving. The hostages were dead. The 2 men who had taken them were dead by their own hands. 2 correctional officers killed by the inmates. 2 inmates dead by their own hands together in the same hallway. The political fallout in South Africa was substantial. The correctional minister, Nkonde Balfour, had been on record 5 months earlier in front of cameras, promising that the security of CMAX would never be breached. The breach had now happened, and it had cost the lives of the unit's senior commander and his acting area coordinator. Posthumous certificates of valour were issued to Sam Gomba and Ben and Denisa at the memorial service on the prison rugby field. The widows received the certificates from Balfour personally. The minister did not, that day, repeat his earlier promise about the security of CMAX. The breach had taken the question off the table. The wing had been built to be impossible to escape from, and on the count of escape, it had succeeded. Nobody had gotten out. The price of that success, however, had been 2 correctional officers killed in a hallway by men who had a smuggled gun. The investigation focused on how the pistol had reached the inside of the most secure prison in the country. The two men suspected of supplying it, the warder Macubella and the inmate Mabuse, went to trial in the Pretoria High Court in 2007. They denied guilt. The trial produced testimony from the inmate witness King Winner Maluleka, who described a deal struck weeks before the killings. Two other inmates received separate sentences for their roles. The case became a turning point in the South African correctional debate. It fueled a sweeping review of internal corruption inside the country's prison system that would, in time, expand into the broader scandals of the next 2 decades. 2 years after Nenyatso's death, a serial criminal named Ananias Mathé escaped from CMAX again, in another incident that drew international attention. And almost 2 decades later, the country was rocked by the fake death escape of Thabo Bester from another facility. Each of those later cases was, in some sense, a continuation of the same conversation about a system in which a corrupt staff member could walk a pistol into a hallway designed to prevent exactly that. Ronnie Nenyatso died because the gates he was counting on to open did not open, and because the man standing next to him in the corridor agreed to finish the job rather than be captured. The story that follows takes place a little over 3 years later, in a North Carolina prison yard at noon, on the other side of the world. There, the killer was not trying to negotiate his way out. He was not waiting for an accomplice. He simply ran for the fences, with 5 months left on a 10-year sentence and a one-way ticket to Honduras waiting for him at the end of it. Case 6. Adelino Nahera, a 33-year-old man with 5 months left on his sentence and a deportation flight to Honduras waiting at the end of it, climbed the first fence at a North Carolina prison at noon on an ordinary Tuesday in January. He climbed the second one too. A correctional officer ordered him to stop. He kept running. The officer shot him as he cleared the top of the second fence. He was dead before the medical staff reached him. He had been less than half a year from walking out the front gate. Adelino Nahera was a Honduran national, 33 years old, serving a 10-year sentence for a second-degree murder conviction handed down in Stokes County, North Carolina, in 2001. Stokes County sits up in the rural northwest corner of the state, against the Virginia border, a landscape of small towns and farms north of Winston-Salem. It is not a place that produces many headlines. The underlying killing is the part of the record where the public file gets thin. The North Carolina Department of Corrections spokesman, Keith Acree, described it in 2 sentences to local press in the hours after the prison shooting. He said Nahera had shot a person in the face. He did not name the victim. The Stokes County court records that would normally fill in the gaps for a homicide of that era are not available in the standard public databases. The appellate courts have no published opinion under his name, which suggests the conviction came from a plea rather than a contested trial. The victim's name, the date, the location, the motive, the precise circumstances of the shooting, all of it remains essentially undocumented in available public sources. What can be said is what the state of North Carolina charged him with, what he pleaded to, and the sentence he received. Second-degree murder, 10 years. A federal deportation order directing that he be removed to Honduras upon release. That order was the part of the story that made the morning of his death so strange. He had been on track to walk out of an American prison in June of 2008 and be put on a plane home. He was held in Johnston Correctional Institution, a medium-security men's facility near Smithfield, North Carolina, with a maximum operating capacity of 644 inmates. The institution sits on a flat stretch of farmland in the central part of the state, well inland, miles from any city. There are no woods inside the perimeter. The fences are the kind a man can see across from one side to the other. Nothing about the design of the facility, in the middle of a January afternoon, would have given a fleeing inmate cover. A medium security yard, by design, is not a high walls and towers institution. It runs on multiple fences. It runs on counts. It runs on the assumption that the men inside it are not, as a population, the kind who will choose to climb in broad daylight. Most of them, with a release date on the horizon, will not. At about noon on the 22nd of January 2008, Adelino Nahera began climbing. He scaled the first perimeter fence, then he ran for the second. A correctional officer in the yard, whose name was never publicly released by the Department of Correction, ordered him to stop. The officer repeated the command. Nahera kept running. He scaled the second fence. As he reached the top, the officer fired. Nahera was struck. He fell. He died at the scene. The North Carolina Department of Correction's public account of what happened, given to WRAL News later that day, came from spokesman Keith Acree in the form of two short statements. The first was operational. Nahera, 33, had scaled 2 fences at Johnston Correctional Institution about noon, the spokesman said. A correctional officer had shot and killed him after he ignored repeated commands to stop. The second was a defense of the use of force. At a medium security institution like this one, the spokesman said, state law allowed corrections officers to use deadly force to stop an escaping felon. That, he said, was what they had done in this case. The North Carolina statute Acree was citing has been on the books for decades. It permits the use of deadly force to prevent the escape of a felon from a state correctional facility. There is no requirement that the inmate be armed. There is no requirement that the inmate be presenting an active threat. The fact of the escape attempt by a person already convicted of a felony is the legal trigger. The officer who shot Adelino Nahera was operating well within his authority. He remained on his normal duties through the rest of the afternoon. The State Bureau of Investigation opened a routine review. WRAL's reporting at the time did not specify the number of shots fired. It did not specify whether the weapon used had been a shotgun or a rifle. It did not specify whether Nahera had been armed himself, although there is no public indication that he was. There had been a similar escape attempt at the same facility 7 years earlier, in 2001, in which an inmate named Andres Francisco Vasquez had been shot with shotgun pellets while climbing the perimeter and had survived his wounds. Nahera was not as lucky. The shot that hit him was fatal. The detail that has stayed with anyone who reads the case afterward is the timing. Nahera was already scheduled for release in June. The deportation order to Honduras was already on file. His sentence was almost over. He needed only to keep his head down for the rest of the winter. Instead, on a Tuesday at noon, in broad daylight, in a North Carolina prison yard with no cover and a guard in the watchtower, he chose to climb 2 fences and run. What was waiting for him on the other side of those fences was a flat, exposed stretch of Smithfield area farmland. There was no vehicle waiting. There was no accomplice. There was no plan that anyone investigating the case has ever publicly described. He simply ran. The agency declined, in the days and weeks afterward, to release the inmate file beyond what Acree had already said. There was no investigation report that became public. There was no court filing that emerged. Even the name of the officer who fired the fatal round was never released to the press. The case, as a public document, has stayed almost exactly as small as it was in the first day of WRAL's reporting on it. That choice, by the agency, is the choice that has kept the larger question about Adelino Nahera unanswered for nearly 2 decades. What had been going through his head that Tuesday at noon when he started climbing? Whether he had told anyone inside the unit the night before what he was planning. Whether anyone he had been close to in Honduras had known anything about the escape. None of it is on paper. None of it is in court filings. The agency's position has been that the file is closed. The fact that Adelino Nahera was a Honduran national, scheduled for deportation, and had no American family members to push the case forward through the courts, is part of what has kept the file as quiet as it has been. There were no plaintiffs. There was no political incentive to reopen anything. The case ended in a North Carolina prison yard at noon, and that is where it has stayed. That, more than anything else about the case, is what gives it its strange weight. Most prison breaks are planned for months. Most have a destination. Nahera ran without a destination, into open farmland, in the middle of the day, less than half a year from being a free man. In the months and years afterward, the State Bureau of Investigation's review concluded that the officer had followed proper procedure. No grand jury action against the officer was reported. The agency's stated position effectively settled the matter at the operational level. There was no civil lawsuit by Nahera's family. There was no public statement from the Honduran consulate. There was no community response of the kind that follows shootings by police in civilian settings, because Nahera had been inside a state prison, and the state's authority to use deadly force against an escaping inmate was settled to North Carolina law. The distinction between the inside of a perimeter fence and the outside is, in the law of every American state, a meaningful one. The protections that govern police interactions on city streets do not extend to the inside of a correctional yard. A man climbing a fence has, by his action, made a different category of decision, and the state's response to that decision is governed by a separate body of law. Johnston Correctional Institution itself was reclassified 6 years later, in 2014, from medium custody to minimum custody. The available reporting from that reclassification does not link the change specifically to the Nahera shooting. The state retained the use of deadly force statute that had authorized it. The North Carolina Department of Correction was eventually folded into the broader Department of Public Safety, and the spokesman's role passed to other staff. Keith Acrie's name on those 2 January 2008 statements remains in the public record, the closest thing the case has to a primary source. What can be said honestly about Adelino Nahera is what the operational record says. The operational record in this case does not say much. The Department of Correction reported what it needed to report. It reported the breach of the perimeter. It reported the commands to stop. It reported the non-compliance. It reported the use of deadly force. He was a man whose previous violence is largely undocumented in available public sources, who pleaded to a second-degree murder charge in 2001, who served 7 years of a 10-year sentence in a North Carolina state facility, who was scheduled for release in 5 months, who had a deportation order to Honduras waiting at the gate, who climbed 2 perimeter fences at noon on a Tuesday in January of 2008, who ignored multiple commands to stop, and who was killed at the top of the second fence by a single correctional officer whose name the state never released. What cannot be said honestly is why. There is no recorded statement from Nahera explaining the decision. There is no note. There are no co-conspirators. The available public reporting offers no theory of motive. The simplest reading, by default, is the one that occurs to anyone who hears the timeline. He could not face the 5 months. Or he could not face the flight that would follow them. Or both. Adelino Nahera died at a fence line because some calculation in his head, on a Tuesday in January, had told him that the deportation order on the other side of his 10-year sentence was a thing he could not let arrive. The story to come moves 3.5 years later to the far end of the country, to a maximum security prison on the northern Olympic Peninsula of Washington state. There the killer who would die did not go over the fence. He went through the wall, sitting in the cab of a forklift he had unchained from the prison's industrial laundry, with a co-conspirator behind him holding a guard at scissor point. A short word in the middle of all of this. If these cases are worth the time you are giving them, the subscribe button is free and it makes sure the next investigation reaches you. Case 7. Kevin Newland. 5 years to the day after he had led detectives to his 19-year-old victim's body under the floorboards of his mother's cabin, a Washington state inmate sat down at his sewing machine in the industrial laundry of a maximum security prison and made the last decision of his life. His co-conspirator, a man already serving 163 years for shooting up a shopping mall in Tacoma, grabbed a corrections officer by the throat with a pair of scissors. Newland used the captured officer's keys to unchain a forklift. He drove it through a roll-up door at the back of the prison. He did not make it through the gap. A guard in a tower shot him once in the chest, and he was dead inside 10 minutes. Kevin Wayne Newland was 25 years old. He had grown up in and around Spokane, Washington. By the time he was 20, he had a sufficient record of small offences to be on the periphery of local law enforcement attention. What put him on the front page of the Spokesman Review and at the centre of a Spokane County homicide investigation was a missing person case that opened in the summer of 2006. The young woman who would die at his hands was Jamie Lynn Drake. She was 19 years old. She was the roommate of a woman Newland had been dating. She lived in a Spokane apartment. She drove a silver 1993 Ford Mustang that by every account from her family had been her pride. She was 19. She had a roommate. She had a car she loved. She had the early shape of an adult life in front of her. In June of 2006, Newland took her life inside her own apartment. He drove off in the Mustang. He used her credit cards. He hid her body, wrapped in a blue tarp, in a crawl space at his mother's cabin in Stevens County, the next county north of Spokane. On the 27th of June 2006, after a missing person investigation that ran from Spokane down to King County, he was arrested. Within days, he led detectives to the cabin. He led them to the crawl space. He led them to the body. The investigators who worked the cabin scene that summer have not, in the years since, said much in public about what they found inside that crawl space. The decision to plead the case down through a guilty admission, rather than to put the family through a contested trial, was, in part, an answer to that scene. The investigation file, after that, told a story of a young man who had been an unsettled presence around the Spokane area for some time. While he was being held in the Spokane County Jail in August of 2007, deputies discovered something inside his cell that should have warned the system about what kind of inmate he was going to be in long-term custody. They found bedding knotted into ropes. They found clothing tied into a slip knot. They found a sharpened piece of wood. He had been preparing in jail to escape. He had not gotten the chance. In September of 2007, a Spokane County jury convicted him of first-degree murder. The presiding judge was Superior Court Judge Sam Kozza, who sentenced him in October of that year to 45 years in prison, with his earliest possible release date set for 2049. He would have been nearly 70 years old by then. Kozza, asked years later about Jamie Drake, told the Spokesman Review that most crimes were stupid and senseless, but that this one had been more stupid and senseless than most. In November of 2007, Kevin Newland was transferred to Clallam Bay Corrections Center near Neah Bay on the northern Olympic Peninsula of Washington State, one of the two highest security prisons in the state's system. Clallam Bay sits at the very edge of the country. The water of the Strait of Juan de Fuca is a short drive away. Canada is across the strait. The geography itself is part of the security plan. There is, in any direction from the prison, very little ordinary cover for a man on the run. He was 21 years old when he arrived. He was 25 when he died there. His disciplinary file at Clallam Bay was the kind that staff would later quote at his memorial as evidence that he had never settled. 7 separate infractions between January of 2008 and June of 2011. Fighting, indecent exposure, resisting, not following rules, possession of a television set he had not been authorised to have. None of it had been violent enough to trigger a transfer to the most restricted unit. He stayed on the general line. He was assigned to work in the prison's correctional industries garment shop, where condemned and long-term inmates ran sewing machines and produced the same inmate uniforms and coveralls that they themselves wore. Side by side with him, sewing the same uniforms, was a 25-year-old inmate named Dominic Maldonado. Maldonado's name was already known across Washington state. In November of 2005, when he was 19, he had walked into the Tacoma Mall with multiple firearms and opened fire, wounding 7 people and taking 4 hostages before he was eventually talked down. In 2007, he had been convicted in Pierce County on 15 counts including attempted murder, assault, and kidnapping. His sentence was 163 years. He was, in practical terms, never coming out of a Washington state prison alive. He was, in practical terms, the most dangerous inmate Kevin Newland was likely to meet in his own work assignment. The pairing of those 2 men, side by side at adjacent sewing machines in a correctional industries garment shop, was a kind of operational accident that the prison had not, before the morning of the escape, treated as a problem. The 2 of them planned an escape. They sewed escape paraphernalia, food, water, medicine, the supplies a man would need on the run, into their own clothing. Whether they had been planning the date deliberately, or whether the timing was incidental, is one of the strange details of the case. The morning the breakout happened was the 29th of June 2011, exactly 5 years, to the day, after Kevin Newland had led detectives to Jamie Drake's body. Shortly after 10 in the morning the 2 of them moved. Maldonado approached a corrections officer in the laundry and garment area, scissors from the sewing line in hand, and took him hostage at the neck. While that was happening, Newland used the captured officer's keys to unlock the chain on a forklift that was parked in the work area. He climbed into the cab. He started it. He drove it directly toward the doors of the work area, then through them, then into the perimeter fence beyond. A correctional officer in a watchtower above the work area fired one warning shot. Newland did not stop. The officer fired a second time. The second shot was direct. It hit Newland in the chest. He was pronounced dead inside the prison infirmary within 10 minutes. The moment Newland was dead, Maldonado let the hostage go and surrendered. The whole event, from the first scissor in the laundry to the last shot from the tower, had lasted about 20 minutes. The hostage officer suffered minor injuries. The exact identity of the officer was kept out of the press at the time. The hostage went home from the shift. The chain of command at Clallam Bay, in the days after the incident, met with corrections staff to discuss the planning and the execution of the breakout. The breakout itself had been planned for weeks. The two men had been quietly sewing supplies into their clothing for weeks. The forklift had been a known piece of equipment in the work area for years. The vulnerability had been there the entire time. Both inmates, after the surrender, were found to have been carrying the supplies they had sewn into their clothes. They had been preparing for a life on the run. Whatever route Newland and Maldonado had been planning to take from a Washington state prison on the northern Olympic Peninsula has never been publicly described, because the man with the plan was dead before he could explain it. Maldonado, after his surrender, has not made any public statement about where they were going to go. The supplies in their clothing, food and water and medicine, would have been enough for a few days. After a few days, the men would have needed shelter, transportation, money. None of that, on the Olympic Peninsula in the summer of 2011, was easy to come by for a man on the run. The superintendent of the prison, Ron Fraker, made the operational statement to local press. The Washington Department of Corrections spokesman, Chad Lewis, confirmed that a single correctional officer had fired one shot at Newland and killed him. Lewis said that it was the first time any inmate had been killed by guards at Clallam Bay since the prison had opened in 1985. 26 years of operation, 0 fatal uses of force. Then a forklift coming through a doorway and ending all of it inside 20 minutes. Maldonado, who had been serving the 163 years he was already serving, was transferred after the escape attempt into the prison's intensive management unit. He has been held in that unit since. He spends most of his time alone in a cell. He is now, in practical terms, never going to see general population again. The Drake family was reached for comment by the Spokesman Review. The paper's reporter went back to Judge Cozer for his reaction. Cozer, who had sentenced Newland to 45 years on the assumption that the state would hold him to it, expressed surprise at how short a fraction of that sentence Newland had ended up serving. He had been sentenced in 2007. He had died in 2011. He had served fewer than 4 years of a 45-year term. The arithmetic was the part of the story Cozer, asked about it years later, could not quite get past. Jamie Drake had been 19 years old when Kevin Newland killed her. He had been 25 when he died inside the cab of a forklift. The state had agreed, in 2007, to keep him locked up for 45 years. Less than 4 had passed before the sentence ended itself. The Washington Department of Corrections, in the wake of the incident, tightened tool control procedures across all of its correctional industry's operations. The agency reviewed which inmates could be assigned to which workstations, what tools could be left unlocked at the end of a shift, and what kinds of items, including the chains on parked industrial equipment, needed to be inventoried as carefully as the sewing shop scissors. Access to forklifts and similar heavy industrial equipment in inmate work areas was reviewed. There was no specific statewide legislative change. There did not need to be one. The lesson the prison drew was operational, and it was about the access an inmate population could have to keys and to vehicles in a shared industrial space. Kevin Newland died inside the cab of a forklift on the same anniversary that he had once led detectives to a body in a crawl space. The story to come moves south to Arkansas, to a perimeter fence the Department of Correction had wired with a current strong enough to kill a man who touched it. Case 8. Van Tucker. An Arkansas inmate, 29 years old, with a history of taking a county sheriff hostage and a previous escape on his rap sheet. cleared the inner fence of one of the most secure prisons in the state, and reached for the next one. The next fence was carrying 5,200 volts. He was thrown backward in mid-air. He survived the contact for 3 days in a Little Rock medical center. He died on a Tuesday night in late June, just shy of his 30th birthday. Van Tucker was a habitual offender by any reasonable definition. The Arkansas Department of Corrections spokesman Solomon Graves, who would describe him to local press in the days after his death, called him exactly that. Tucker's record stretched back to the year 2000, to the rural northwest corner of Arkansas, to a small house in Pope County, where a 71-year-old man named Frederick Kane had been his neighbor. Pope County is one of the smaller counties in the state, west of Little Rock, the seat of which is the town of Russellville. The case never produced a published appellate opinion, because the case never reached an appellate court. Tucker pleaded out. Tucker killed Frederick Kane in the year 2000. He was 21 years old at the time. The available reporting does not specify the precise manner of the killing, but the second-degree murder plea that resolved the case the following year, in 2001, suggested no robust premeditation finding. Pope County prosecutors took the plea. Tucker drew a 20-year sentence. The fact that the conviction was second-degree rather than first-degree, the fact that the negotiated term was 20 rather than life, all of it suggested a defendant whose version of events the prosecution could not fully disprove, but whose conduct had clearly killed a 71-year-old man in his own neighborhood. The plea was the kind of resolution that small rural counties had been writing for decades. The state did not have the evidence to take the case to a jury with confidence that it would land on a first-degree conviction. The defense did not have the evidence to walk Tucker out of the courthouse with no time. They met in the middle. The sentence was 20 years. The man Tucker had killed remained dead. The conviction was on the books. The arithmetic of the plea would matter later. 20 years with parole eligibility would put him on the street again before he turned 30. Before he was sentenced, while he was still being held in the Pope County Jail awaiting that case, Van Tucker did something that would, 12 years later, give the story its shape. In the year 2000, inside the jail, he took then Pope County Sheriff Jay Winters hostage for 6 hours, trying to break out. Winters, by his own later account preserved in his Arkansas Democrat Gazette obituary, was held but was unharmed. The 6 hours inside that jail were never fully reconstructed in print. Winters, asked about them in the years afterward, would describe them in the way that sheriffs of a certain generation describe stories like this one. They were stories that came with the job. They were stories that did not get to define the work. Winters would go on to direct the Arkansas Crime Information Center under 2 consecutive governors, and would die in 2021 at the age of 67, with the hostage-taking forming part of the legacy his colleagues remembered him for. The hostage attempt failed. The plea on Kane followed. Tucker went to prison. In 2002, he escaped from the Grimes unit in Jackson County by riding out in the back of a dump truck. He was recaptured quickly. He had served roughly 7 years on the Kane murder sentence when he was paroled in 2008. A 20-year sentence with parole eligibility credits was the kind of math that lined up that way. In Arkansas, in the early 2000s, a second-degree murder plea with no aggravating factors could move through the system on a schedule. The state had not promised that Van Tucker would serve 20 years. The state had promised that Van Tucker had been sentenced to 20 years. Those two things, then and now, are different things. The parole did not last a year. In 2009, in Pope County again, he was convicted of aggravated robbery and aggravated residential burglary. The Arkansas Habitual Offender Statute, which permits enhanced sentencing for defendants with multiple felony priors, applied. He was sentenced to 2 life terms. The Arkansas Supreme Court affirmed the convictions in an opinion published in 2011 in a decision written by Justice Donald Corbin. The published opinion is the one trace of Van Tucker that exists in the formal record of Arkansas appellate law. Everything else about him, the second-degree murder plea, the 6-hour hostage event in the jail, the dump truck out of the Grimes unit, the parole, the new robbery, all of it sat in the operational files of the state's prosecutors and prison officials, but never in the bound volumes of the Arkansas reports. He was transferred to the Varna unit, a maximum security state prison in Lincoln County, Arkansas, where he would spend the last 4 years of his life. The Varna unit is one of the prisons the Arkansas Department of Correction had specifically rebuilt in the mid-2000s to be the kind of facility that the inmates inside it could not get out of. The perimeter consisted of multiple fences. The centre fence was an electrified lethal current barrier built by inmate labour and activated in January of 2005. It carried 5,200 volts. The signage around it warned of exactly what it would do to a man who touched it. Lethal current perimeter fences are not common in American corrections. They exist at a handful of facilities, and they exist because the state in question has decided that the marginal cost of warning signs and high voltage is worth the elimination of any possibility that an inmate can hand over hand his way out of the wire. The Varna unit's fence had been built by inmate labour in the years before its activation. The men who had built it had known exactly what it was going to do. On the morning of Saturday, the 22nd of June 2013, Van Tucker attempted his last escape. He cleared one internal fence, a non-electrified line. He started toward the next one. He reached the top. The Arkansas Department of Corrections official statement to the Arkansas Democrat Gazette, given the following Wednesday, described what happened in operational language. Tucker had suffered head trauma after clearing the internal fence and then attempting to scale the lethal fence carrying 5,200 volts of electricity. He was thrown clear. He was struck against the ground. He was airlifted to the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences Medical Center in Little Rock. He survived for 3 days. He died at 8:57 on Tuesday evening, the 25th of June 2013, of injuries the Arkansas Department of Correction described, without further forensic detail, as cumulative. The medical staff at UAMS in Little Rock kept him alive for those 3 days. Whether any meaningful communication was possible between him and the family who came to the hospital is not part of the public record. He died short of his 30th birthday. Solomon Graves, the Arkansas Department of Correction spokesman, would later cite Tucker as the most recent inmate to die in Arkansas custody trying to escape, until another Varna inmate did the same thing 3 years later. The system, on the count of escape from the Varna unit specifically, had functioned the way it was designed to function. Nobody had gotten over the second fence. Nobody had gotten outside the wire. The barrier between an Arkansas maximum security prison and the open country around it had held. That, in the language of the Arkansas Department of Correction, was the entire point of the lethal fence. It was not a deterrent. It was a barrier. A man could attempt to cross it, and the consequences of the attempt would not depend on a guard's reaction time, would not depend on a watchtower sightline, would not depend on whether the responding officer was correctly positioned. The fence itself would handle the response. The decision had been made years before the man attempting to cross it ever arrived at the unit. The aftermath of Tucker's death played out in 2 registers. The official register was muted. The Arkansas Department of Correction made no policy changes. The system had worked. The man who had attempted the escape was dead. The signage around the lethal fence was already prominent. The state would not, the agency made clear, alter its perimeter security in light of the outcome. The unofficial register, in the comments sections of the Arkansas Democrat Gazette's online coverage and on local Arkansas radio call-in shows, was darker. Tucker was not, by any local measure, a man who had drawn sympathy. He had killed his elderly neighbour. He had taken a sheriff hostage for 6 hours during a previous attempt to break out. He had been paroled, and he had not stayed out. The gallows humour in the comment threads was the kind that follows a man whose record had given his death a certain blunt logic to the people who had been reading about him for 13 years. The other piece of the aftermath was the long career of Jay Winters. The Pope County Sheriff Tucker had taken hostage in the year 2000 had moved on to a state-level position, running the Arkansas Crime Information Center, the database of criminal record information used by Arkansas law enforcement statewide. He served in that role under Governor Mike Beebe and then under Governor Asa Hutchinson. He died in 2021, 8 years after Van Tucker died at the Varna unit fence line. His obituary, which appeared in the Arkansas Democrat Gazette, mentioned the 6-hour hostage event as part of the formative experiences of his career. It was, in some sense, the kind of story that follows a man who works in rural Arkansas law enforcement long enough. A jail inmate had once held him for 6 hours. That inmate had been Van Tucker. Tucker had then served his sentence, been paroled, gone back inside on new charges, and ended his life at a Varna unit fence. The arc of the story was over before Jay Winters retired. Van Tucker died because the Varna unit's outer fence carried a current strong enough to throw him from it before he could clear it. The story to come takes place at the same Arkansas prison 3 years later, at almost the same point on the same perimeter. The man who died next had been convicted of one of the worst homicides in Arkansas in the early 2000s, and on a Thursday afternoon in April of 2016, he ignored a verbal warning from 2 corrections officers and made a run for the same fences. The fences were the same ones Tucker had tried to clear 3 years earlier. The system was the same one. The result, the second time, was different in shape, but identical in outcome. If this kind of breakdown is the thing you keep coming back for, subscribing is the easiest way to make sure the next one finds you. No cost, no pressure, and it is what makes this channel run. Case 9. Christopher Wilson. A husband came home from work on a Friday evening in late December of 2002 and found his 26-year-old wife dead in the driveway of their small house in Saltillo, Arkansas. He went inside. The dinner she had been cooking was still bubbling on the stove. The 8-month-old baby was inside the house. Both of them were gone. The neighbour who had done it would be in custody by the next afternoon and would spend the next 13 years in an Arkansas state prison until on a Thursday afternoon in April of 2016, he ran for the same set of fences that had killed Van Tucker 3 years earlier and was killed by 2 officers before he got there. Christopher Wilson was 41 years old at the time of his death. He had been born and raised in the rural reaches of central Arkansas. He had a prior record in Lonoke County for drug, theft and weapons charges, the kind of file that placed him on local law enforcement's radar without ever quite escalating to the level of a major case. The Lonoke County priors had been the kind that small-town prosecutors handle by the hundred, and they had never, in any of the available reporting, included a violent crime. Wilson's escalation, in late December of 2002, from low-level offender to capital defendant, happened inside a single winter evening on one neighbour's property. He lived on Highway 286 in the small community of Saltillo in Faulkner County, a short distance from the family of Pamela Reed. The victims were Pamela K. Reed, 26 years old, and her infant son, Lucas Aaron Reed. The husband was Kenneth Reed. The family lived a few hundred yards down the road from Wilson. They were, in every sense the word implies, neighbours. The killing happened on the 27th of December, 2002, a Friday evening. Pamela was at home with the baby. She had been cooking dinner. Wilson came into the house. The struggle that followed moved from inside the house out into the carport. 2 knives broke during the attack. Bloody footprints, when investigators reconstructed the scene afterward, documented her movements. The medical examiner could not establish the exact number of wounds. She had been a young mother, 26 years old, with a small child inside the house. The carport where she died was not, by neighbours' descriptions, more than a few steps from her own front door. What happened to the baby is the part of the case this account is not going to describe. The dossier on the case does describe it. The criminal record does describe it. The defendant himself, in his confession to investigators, described it. The detail does not need to be repeated here. It is enough to say that the violence that ended Pamela Reed's life had not been the end of what happened in that house. Christopher Wilson had come back inside the home after the carport, and he had not left a survivor. The dossier the prosecution would have put in front of a jury, if the case had gone to trial, was the kind that the family said openly they did not want to have to listen to in open court. It was the central reason a plea agreement was reached. Kenneth Reed got home from work at about 6:30 in the evening. He saw his wife's body first. He went inside the house. He found the rest. The single sentence describes the experience of a man whose life ended, in any meaningful sense, in the same evening his wife's did. Kenneth Reed's testimony, the details of what he had walked into, has been kept by the Faulkner County records as part of the case file. The family asked, then and afterward, for the public not to repeat it. The Faulkner County Sheriff's Office responded fast. The spokesman who briefed local press, Jack Pike, did not need to look far for a suspect. Wilson lived a short walk down the road. He was a known figure in the area. He was in custody by the late afternoon of the following day. He was held without bond by a Faulkner County judge named Charles Clawson at the request of the local prosecuting attorney, H.G. Foster, pending capital murder charges. Wilson's court-appointed defence attorney advised the court at the first appearance that competency might become an issue in the case. It did not. The lead investigator on the case, a retired Arkansas State Police investigator named Carl Bird, was the man who took Wilson's confession. Bird would later tell the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette that during interrogation, Wilson tried to play crazy in an attempt to convince the investigator that he had been mentally incompetent at the time of the killings. Bird refused to bite. After the confession came out, Wilson said to him, almost casually, that he had messed up. Bird's reply, by his own account, was simple. He told Wilson, yes, he had. In 2003, Wilson pleaded guilty in Faulkner County Circuit Court to 2 counts of capital murder. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences without parole. The plea was accepted, prosecutors said at the time, because the Reed family had specifically asked not to have to sit through the crime scene testimony in open court. The trial details would have been put in front of a jury. The family did not want to be in the room for it. A guilty plea, with 2 life terms, was the agreement that closed the case. Christopher Wilson went to the Arkansas Department of Correction in 2003. He spent the next 13 years inside the system. By the spring of 2016, he was housed in the general population of the Varna unit, the same Lincoln County maximum security prison where Van Tucker had died 3 years earlier. The Varna unit had not, by the spring of 2016, changed its perimeter design after the Tucker incident. The lethal fence was still there. The signage was still there. The state had concluded, in 2013, that the system worked the way it was meant to work, and there was no reason to redesign it. On Thursday, the 7th of April 2016, shortly before 1 in the afternoon, Christopher Wilson attempted to escape the Varna unit's fenced perimeter. The Arkansas Department of Corrections account of what happened next was, by design, sparse. 2 correctional officers intercepted him. They issued verbal commands to stop. The spokesman, Solomon Graves, gave a single quoted line to local press in the days afterward. The officers, he said, had given Wilson a demand to cease his activity, and Wilson had failed to comply. When Wilson did not stop, the 2 officers opened fire. He was killed at the scene. Solomon Graves identified Wilson, in his statement to the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, as the first Arkansas Department of Correction inmate since 1991 to die from the use of deadly force inside the state's correctional system. The previous case had been an inmate killed at another Arkansas unit in 1991 while attempting to attack a fellow prisoner, not while escaping. So the line Solomon Graves was drawing was a precise one. In 25 years of operations across the Arkansas Department of Correction, Christopher Wilson had been the first inmate killed by guards in the course of an attempted escape. The 2 officers who shot him were placed on paid administrative leave. The Arkansas State Police investigated. The completed report was turned over to the local prosecutor for review. The Arkansas Department of Correction declined to release the operational details of the escape itself. How Wilson had come to be in a position to attempt a breach, what he had been carrying, whether he had been armed, how he had cleared the inner fence, none of it was put on the public record. The state police investigation was, in the framing of the agency, the proper venue for those questions. That framing is one of the recurring features of cases where an inmate is killed by guards inside an American correctional facility. The operational details, in the immediate aftermath, are not for the press. They are for the investigating agency. Whether the inmate had a weapon, how he had gotten through the inner fence, whether there had been any verbal exchange beyond the recorded commands, all of it goes into the file, and the file goes to the state police, and the state police in turn send the report to the local prosecutor. The case closed as a justified use of force. The 2 officers returned to duty. The Arkansas State Police Review found no fault. The Reed family, who had agreed back in 2003 to a plea agreement specifically so they would not have to sit through any of the case in public, did not give a public statement about the prison shooting. The family's reaction has not been published. The deputy prosecuting attorney from the original case, Marcus Vaden, had called Wilson's crimes heartless and ruthless at the time of the plea. Vaden had been the deputy out of the 15th Judicial District Prosecuting Attorney's Office at the time of the case. He had handled the briefing of the family. He had been one of the people in the room when the decision to take the guilty plea was reached. The prosecuting attorney, H.G. Foster, called it the kind of case that stayed with a person. A bad one, was the way Foster put it. Foster would later go on to become a circuit court judge. Carl Bird, the investigator who had taken the confession, would tell the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette years later that Wilson had given him, during interrogation, a story about Pamela Reed having been a drug case informant who had gotten him in trouble. Bird had not accepted that as the real motive. He had told the paper that Wilson had other motives and had declined to elaborate further. What Bird had meant by that has never been publicly explained. The deeper motive remains, in the record, a closed door. Wilson had given Bird a cover story, and Bird had not believed the cover story, and Wilson had then admitted to the killings without offering anything that the lead investigator was willing to put on paper as a real reason. Whatever had actually happened between the Wilsons and the Reeds in the months before that August evening in Saltillo, it was the kind of thing a long-time investigator had decided was not for the press release. Christopher Wilson died at the same perimeter where Van Tucker had died 3 years earlier, on the same Arkansas maximum security prison grounds, in the same agency's custody. The story to come is the last one in this account, and it is the one where the killer who died had the longest head start of any of them. He got out of his transport bus on a county highway in May of 2022. He had 3 weeks on the run, and the way he ended his own freedom on a road in Atascosa County, Texas, in the early hours of a June morning, would close the longest manhunt the Texas Department of Criminal Justice had ever run for a single escaped inmate. Case 10. Gonzalo Lopez, a Mexican mafia hitman with 2 life sentences, freed himself from his hand and leg restraints on a Texas prison bus, cut his way through the expanded metal cage in the back, crawled out the bottom, attacked the driver, and walked out the back doors of a wrecked bus into the woods. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice did not have him back for 3 weeks. They had him back finally, on a road in Atascosa County, Texas, in the early hours of June, with 5 people dead at a family cabin 200 miles north, and a stolen pickup truck on its rims after 4 flat tires from a set of spike strips. He died on that road with an AR-15 in his hands. The deputies who shot him said afterward that he had not stopped firing until he ran out of ammunition. Gonzalo Lopez was 46 years old. He had been a hitman for the Mexican mafia prison gang. He was already serving 2 life sentences. The first life sentence had come out of Hidalgo County, Texas, in 2006 for a capital murder he had carried out the year before. The victim, a 37-year-old man named Jose Guadalupe Ramirez, had been kidnapped from his own home in Weslaco, Texas, on the 23rd of March 2005 by Lopez and an accomplice, and was killed shortly afterward. Lopez later confessed to the killing during the 2005 investigation. Prosecutors tied the murder to his activities as a member of the Mexican mafia prison gang and alleged that a contract killing arrangement had driven the abduction. The second life sentence had been for the attempted capital murder of 2 Webb County police officers. In May of 2004, in a vehicle chase along the Texas-Mexico border, Lopez and a driver had exchanged gunfire with deputies from Zapata and Webb counties. Lopez had escaped capture that night. He was indicted and convicted afterward. The 2 sentences ran consecutively. The Texas system, for any inmate with 2 life terms running consecutively, was telling him in clear paperwork that the only way out was through the medical bay or through the chamber, and there was no chamber waiting because his crime had not drawn a death sentence. He was a life without walking out inmate, the kind of inmate, in correctional theory, who has nothing to lose. He was, by the time he was transported on the 12th of May 2022, on a Texas Department of Criminal Justice bus from the Hughes unit in Gatesville to a medical appointment in Huntsville, a man who had been told, twice, in 2 separate Texas counties, that he would never get out of the state's custody. The state did not yet know that the man in the back of that bus was a previous escapee. His classification file did not have the flag. His mugshot in the system's records was outdated. The staffing level at the Hughes unit on the morning his transport was loaded was at 57%. 318 of the unit's 556 officer positions were filled. There were 2 officers aboard the bus and 16 prisoners. Lopez had, hidden on his person, what the Texas State Senator John Whitmire would later describe in a press briefing as a prison-made knife and a key. The scan of the inmate's body that should have caught both items in the chair Hughes unit staff were supposed to use before transport, a device known as the BOSS chair, had been skipped. Staff at the unit, the agency would conclude in a December review, had become complacent. They had circumvented security procedures in favour of completing their responsibilities in a cursory manner. Those breakdowns had become routine. On the bus, in the caged, restricted housing compartment, Lopez slipped his handcuffs. He used the key to free his leg restraints. He cut through the expanded metal cage with the prison-made knife. He crawled out underneath it. He moved among his fellow prisoners. He tried to recruit them. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice's later serious incident review reported the exchange in plain terms. Lopez had asked the other men if they were ready to rock and roll, or something like it, and he had told them it was their lucky day. One inmate said yes at first. When Lopez laid out the plan, which was to kill both transport officers, hijack a passing car on Interstate 45, and drive to San Antonio, that inmate said no. Lopez moved up the aisle alone. He attacked the driver with the knife. The driver fought back. The struggle was brief and physical. Lopez was a man who had killed before, and he was a man with a knife, and the bus driver was a man whose hands had been full of a steering wheel and a radio. The injuries the driver took were serious enough to require treatment, but not life-threatening. The bus stopped on Highway 7 in Leon County. The 2 officers and Lopez ended up off the bus. Lopez ran back aboard, drove the bus away alone, and made it about a mile before the officers, who had fired at him as he drove away, hit the rear tyre. The bus wrecked. Lopez ran out the back and into the trees. The driver's stab wounds were not life-threatening. The Texas Department of Public Safety added him to the state's Texas 10 Most Wanted Fugitives list the next day. The reward was set at $50,000 by the 3rd day. Over 400 officers joined the search. Sniffer dogs, mounted units, helicopters with thermal optics, boats on the rivers. The terrain east of Gatesville is open country, dense with creek bottoms and pine woods, and Lopez disappeared into it. For 21 days, the manhunt did not find him. Somewhere around the 31st of May, a residential cabin near a place called Centerville, in Leon County, was burglarized. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice spokesman Robert Hurst would later confirm to local press that Lopez's DNA had been recovered from the inside of that earlier cabin. The Centerville area sits about 40 miles east of where Lopez had jumped from the wrecked bus. Across the 3 weeks of the manhunt, in other words, he had been moving south and east through the East Texas pine country into precisely the kind of weekend ranch terrain where families spent their summers. The cabin sat near the boundary of a weekend ranch belonging to a Houston area family named Collins. Lopez's DNA would later be found inside the burglarized cabin. The timing of that intrusion, by the Texas Department of Criminal Justice's later reconstruction, placed him in the area between 24 and 48 hours before he attacked the Collins family. The residents of the surrounding properties were not warned. On the afternoon of the 2nd of June, 2022, Gonzalo Lopez forced his way into the Collins family weekend cabin. Inside the cabin were Mark Collins, 66 years old, and 4 of his grandchildren. The oldest grandson, Waylon, was 18. Carson was 16. Hudson was 11. Bryson, the boy's cousin, was also 11. All 4 were students in the Tomball Independent School District, a suburban district north of Houston. They were at the family ranch for the weekend. It was an ordinary thing for a family to be doing on a June afternoon. The grandfather, the grandsons, the cousin. The cabin had been a weekend retreat. It was not on any kind of secure, remote property. It was the kind of place that had a road in and a road out, and surrounding ranches and weekend houses on every side. What happened inside that cabin is the part of this account that does not need to be described in detail. The combined Texas Department of Criminal Justice and CGL Companies review, released on the 8th of December 2022, recorded the cause of death for all 5 family members as a combination of gunshot, sharp force, and stab wounds. Lopez took an AR-15 rifle from the cabin. He took a pistol. He took a pickup truck from the property. He drove away. A relative who had not heard from Mark Collins called for a welfare check that evening. Deputies arrived at the cabin around 6 in the evening. They found the 5 bodies. By that hour, the stolen pickup was already 220 miles south. Atascosa County Sheriff's deputies, working off the description from the Centerville scene, spotted the truck in Jourdanton, about 35 miles south of San Antonio. They put a spike strip across the road. Lopez ran over it. All 4 tires blew out. He crashed into telephone poles and into a fence. He came out of the cab with the AR-15 and the pistol still on him, and he opened fire on the deputies. Officers returned fire. The exchange did not last long. Lopez fired, by the later accounts of the deputies on scene, until he ran out of ammunition. He went down on the street with the rifle still in his hands. He had never been recaptured. He was killed at the scene. No officers were injured. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice Chief of Staff, Jason Clark, would tell reporters at a press conference that same night that Lopez had fired several rounds at officers and had been armed with an AR-15 and a pistol. The aftermath inside the Texas correctional system was immediate. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice suspended all inmate transports on the 6th of June, 2022, pending a comprehensive review of its transportation procedures. The Serious Incident Review, released 6 months later, on the 8th of December, named the failures. The BOSS chair scan had been skipped. The cuff protectors used in Lopez's restraints had not fully covered the keyholes. Staff had falsified documents regarding cell searches and security rounds. Lopez's record had never been updated to flag him as a previous escapee. The first responding officer after the bus crash had not pursued or fired at Lopez as he fled into the woods. The agency disciplined more than 20 staff members and supervisors. New procedures required 3 officers on every transport bus going forward, and the installation of video surveillance equipment on those buses. The Tomball superintendent, Dr. Martha Salazar Zamora, gave the school district's statement to the Associated Press on the 3rd of June. She said there were no words. The community, she said, was pulling together following the tragic loss of 4 students. The Collins family's attorneys notified the agency of intent to sue. Andy Cahan of Crime Stoppers of Houston met with the family. The Tomball district held vigils for the 4 boys. Mark Collins was buried alongside them. The grandfather and the 4 boys had been a single weekend. The cabin would have been a temporary stop in the family's calendar. Instead, it became, on the 2nd of June, the place where Mark Collins and his grandchildren died at the hands of a man who had been on the run from a Texas prison transport bus for almost 3 weeks. The Serious Incident Review went further than the agency had originally indicated it would. It documented complacency that had become routine practice at the Hughes unit. It documented falsified records. It documented an outdated mugshot and a missing escapee flag. The review's findings became the basis of internal disciplinary actions against more than 20 correctional staff and supervisors at the unit. The agency did not, in its public statements, name the disciplined staff. The disciplinary actions were a matter of personnel record. 10 killers across almost 90 years of correctional history. All of them died trying to get out. Some of them never cleared the first fence. The ones who did not get far enough to be free. Subscribe so the next case finds you, and we will see you on the next investigation.